For 22 years, Walter Koenig was the helpful neighbor who fixed everyone's appliances, taught chess to retirees, and never missed his grandson's birthday. When FBI agents arrested him in 2009, his daughter learned that everything she knew about her father was a lie, and that the kind old man who had raised her had spent 44 years betraying the country his own son had served in uniform. Walter Koenig woke at 6:30 on the morning of March 17, 2009, exactly as he had for the past 22 years. He was 79 years old, and his knees hurt when he climbed out of bed, but his mind remained sharp, and his habits remained precise. He put on the coffee, the same routine he had followed since moving to the Potomac Gardens retirement community in 1987. Through his kitchen window, he could see the walking path where he would take his morning constitutional in exactly 40 minutes. His neighbors knew him as the helpful German immigrant who fixed their garbage disposals and taught chess on Tuesday afternoons at the community center. The widower, who always had time to help carry groceries or explain how to use a new cell phone. Walter had lived a quiet life for so long that the quietness had become who he was. The person he had been before, the person who had lived a different kind of life entirely, felt like someone from another lifetime. He was pouring his second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. 7:15 in the morning was early for visitors. Walter felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in many years. Through the peephole, he saw two men in dark suits and a woman in a blue jacket. Behind them, at the curb, sat two black sedans. Walter stood very still, his hand on the doorknob, and felt time collapse. He had known this moment would come eventually, or perhaps he had convinced himself it never would. The years had passed so smoothly, so ordinarily, that the past had seemed safely buried beneath decades of respectability. The doorbell rang again. Walter opened the door. The taller man held up a badge and identification. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words sounded distant, as if spoken through water. The man was saying something about a warrant, about needing to come inside, about Walter's rights under the Constitution. Walter stepped back and let them enter. 4 more agents came through the door behind the first 3. They moved through his small apartment with practiced efficiency, opening closets, checking under furniture, examining his desk. The woman in the blue jacket stayed with him in the living room. She introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Holbrook. She asked if he understood why they were there. Walter looked at the chess set on his coffee table, the game he had been playing against himself the night before. White was winning. He had always preferred white. He said yes, he understood. His accent was slight after 57 years in America, but it had never completely disappeared. German-born, the neighbors thought. They had no idea where he had really come from. Agent Holbrook asked if he would be willing to come to their office to answer some questions. She said they could do this the easy way or the difficult way. The choice was his. Walter thought about his daughter Christine, who lived in Pennsylvania with her husband and 2 children. He thought about his son Michael, the retired Army colonel who called every Sunday evening. He said he would come voluntarily. There was no point in making this harder than it needed to be. The life he had built so carefully was ending. Perhaps it had always been an illusion anyway. Berlin was a city of ruins in 1945. Walter Hartmann, not yet Koenig, was 15 years old and hungry in ways that went beyond food. His father had died in the last desperate weeks of the war, his mother 2 months later from pneumonia, in an unheated apartment. He lived in the Soviet sector, in the basement of a bombed-out building with 6 other orphaned boys. They survived by scavenging, stealing, trading whatever could be found in the rubble for bread or potatoes. The city was divided among the victors. Soviet soldiers were everywhere, occupying a capital that had once ruled half of Europe. Walter learned quickly to be invisible, to avoid attention, to slip through the chaos without being noticed. In the summer of 1947, a man named Dmitry Sokolov approached him in the ruins of the Reichstag. Walter was 17 by then, thin and quick, known among the street children as someone who could get into locked buildings and emerge with things worth selling. Sokolov was NKVD, Soviet intelligence, though Walter did not learn that term until later. He spoke reasonable German and wore a Soviet army uniform without insignia. He offered Walter a job that paid in real money, American cigarettes, and regular meals. The work was simple at first. Watch certain buildings in the western sectors, note who came and went, report what he saw. Walter accepted without hesitation. Ideology meant nothing to him. Survival meant everything. Over the following year, the work evolved. Sokolov taught him to be more than a watcher. He taught him to remember conversations, to notice patterns, to understand what information mattered and what did not. In 1948, Walter was sent to a training facility outside Dresden. The war had been over for 3 years, but new kinds of warfare were beginning. The instructors were Soviet intelligence officers preparing agents for long-term operations in the West. Walter learned English from Americans who had defected or been captured during the war. He learned American customs, American history, American mannerisms. He watched American films and read American magazines until he could imagine what life was like in that distant country. The training lasted 2 years. Walter was patient, observant, gifted with languages and an ability to blend into backgrounds. The instructors noted these qualities in their reports. He would be useful in America, they decided. Not immediately, but eventually. In 1950, Walter was given new papers identifying him as Walter Koenig, ethnic German displaced by the war. The identity came with a manufactured history, forged documents, references from people who did not exist. He was moved to the American Zone in West Germany, to a displaced persons camp where refugees waited for immigration approval. The camp was chaos, thousands of people with tragic stories and desperate hopes. Walter lived there for 2 years, working in the camp administration office, establishing his legend as a quiet refugee seeking a new start. His handler visited once every 3 months, always in disguise, always with new instructions. In January of 1952, Walter's immigration papers were approved. He would go to America as a refugee, sponsored by a Lutheran church group in New Jersey. He was 22 years old and trained to be someone he was not. He boarded a ship in Bremen and watched Europe disappear behind him. The past was gone. The future was a foreign country where he would live a lie so complete it would eventually become more real than the truth. Walter arrived in New York Harbor on a cold morning in February 1952. He stood at the ship's rail and watched the Statue of Liberty emerge from the fog, that symbol every immigrant knew, and felt nothing except calculation. The church sponsors met him at the dock, kind people who spoke of God's providence and America's generosity. They drove him to a boarding house in Newark, where 6 other refugees shared meals and practiced English in the evenings. He found work within 2 weeks at a machine shop in Jersey City. The pay was modest, but steady. He operated a lathe, making parts for industrial equipment, learning American workplace culture through observation and careful mimicry. His English improved rapidly. He had been well trained, but real fluency came only through immersion. He listened to radio programs, read newspapers, studied how Americans moved and spoke and thought. In 1953, he enrolled in evening courses at a technical college. Engineering principles, mathematics, technical drawing. His instructors noted his aptitude and his discipline. He was the student who always arrived early and stayed late, the one who asked precise questions. Barbara Hoffman worked at the college registrar's office. She was 24, second-generation German-American, with dark hair and a shy smile. Walter noticed her because his training had taught him to notice everything, but he found himself genuinely attracted to her kindness. Their courtship was slow and conventional. Weekend movies, Sunday dinners with her parents, conversations about ordinary futures. Barbara had no way of knowing that Walter's ordinariness was a carefully constructed performance. They married in October 1954 in a Lutheran church in Hoboken. Walter had not contacted his handlers in 30 months. This was the plan: build the legend, establish roots, become boringly normal. Soviet intelligence played patient games. Their daughter, Christine, was born in July 1955. Walter held his newborn child in the hospital and felt an emotion he had not anticipated. The compartmentalization that had seemed simple in theory became complicated by love he had not planned to feel. Their son Michael arrived in April 1957. Walter was 27 years old, a father of 2, a machine shop foreman studying engineering, a model immigrant living the American dream. He bought a small house in a working-class neighborhood, a 3-bedroom with a yard where children could play. He joined the PTA at Christine's school, volunteered for church cleanup days, became the kind of neighbor people waved to but barely noticed. The years passed without contact from Moscow. Walter sometimes wondered if he had been forgotten, if the investment in his training had been written off, if he was free to simply be Walter Koenig without the weight of another identity. But he knew better than to hope. He maintained the habits he had been taught. He varied his routes, watched for surveillance, kept his finances simple and his profile low. He was a dormant asset, carefully preserved, waiting for activation. In May of 1959, 7 years after his arrival in America, a man approached him at a bus stop. The man asked for directions to a restaurant that did not exist. Walter gave the correct countersign response. The activation phrase he had memorized in Dresden a decade earlier. The waiting was over. The useful phase of his operation was beginning. Walter Koenig, American immigrant, husband and father, was now also something else entirely. The compartmentalization was complete. Walter was hired by Brennan Engineering in April 1960. The company held contracts with Lockheed Martin, subcontracting on missile guidance systems and satellite components. His engineering degree and 8 years of machine shop experience made him a strong candidate. The family moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, into a development of identical houses filled with young families pursuing suburban prosperity. Barbara was happy. The new house was larger, the neighborhood better, the schools excellent for Christine and Michael. His security clearance came through in September. Nothing high-level, just secret, but it gave him access to technical specifications, design documents, manufacturing processes, exactly the kind of information his training had prepared him to collect. The first contact came on a Saturday in October. Walter was at a hardware store buying paint when a man bumped into him near the register. The brush pass was so smooth that Walter barely registered the exchange. In his pocket, he found a slip of paper with coordinates and a time. He went to the location 3 days later, Rock Creek Park, a walking trail few people used on Tuesday afternoons. The man from the hardware store was waiting on a bench, feeding pigeons. They did not speak for long. The handler, who said to call him Victor, explained what Moscow wanted. Technical documents, manufacturing specifications, anything related to guidance systems or satellite technology. Nothing dramatic, just steady collection of useful intelligence. The payment was $300 monthly, delivered through dead drops. Walter was instructed to make no sudden purchases, no changes to his lifestyle. The money should improve his life gradually, invisibly. Walter began photographing documents that autumn. He used a Minox camera hidden in a hollowed-out engineering textbook he carried in his briefcase. The work took place in his basement at night, while Barbara slept, and the children did homework upstairs. He photographed specifications for missile gyroscopes, technical analyses of Soviet satellite capabilities, design modifications to guidance computers, material that helped Soviet engineers understand American approaches and identify weaknesses to exploit. The dead drops followed a rotating schedule. A hollow tree near the Maryland border, a loose brick in a park wall, a drainage pipe near Great Falls. Walter serviced the drops during weekend errands, stopping at hardware stores or gardening centers as cover for his routes. Barbara noticed nothing. Walter was simply a dedicated engineer who brought work home, a conscientious husband who ran weekend errands, a good father who attended every school play and baseball game. The compartmentalization that had begun in Berlin was now complete. Walter's two lives existed in separate spaces, never touching, never contaminating each other. He was genuinely both people, the suburban father and the Soviet agent, without apparent contradiction. His handlers were pleased with the quality of his intelligence. The technical documents he provided gave Soviet designers insights into American manufacturing techniques and system vulnerabilities. Not earth-shattering secrets, but steady, useful intelligence that accumulated value over time. By 1965, Walter had been operating actively for 5 years. The routine had become automatic, the anxiety manageable. He had photographed thousands of pages of documents, serviced over 60 dead drops, met with 4 different handlers. The money accumulated slowly. Walter explained the gradual improvements in their lifestyle as raises and bonuses from work. A newer car, a finished basement, a family vacation to the Great Smoky Mountains. Nothing excessive, nothing that drew attention. He was exactly what Soviet intelligence had invested a decade to create. A reliable long-term asset, deeply embedded in American society, producing steady intelligence without drama or risk. The useful phase of his operation had begun, and it would continue for 23 more years. Walter's competence at Brennan Engineering led to promotion in 1966. He became a project supervisor, overseeing teams working on satellite communication systems. The increased responsibility brought increased access to classified materials. He photographed design specifications for orbital tracking systems, technical proposals for military communications satellites, vulnerability assessments of Soviet space capabilities. The material was more valuable than anything he had provided before. Victor was replaced by a handler who called himself Pavel in 1967. Pavel was younger, more demanding, less patient than Victor had been. He wanted more frequent meetings, better quality documents, expansion of Walter's access through cultivating additional sources. Walter began developing relationships with colleagues who had useful access. Casual friendships built over lunch breaks and after-work drinks. Conversations that revealed who was working on what, who had clearances for which programs, who had personal vulnerabilities that might be exploited. In the spring of 1968, Walter noticed Janet Pierce in the cafeteria. She was a technical writer, recently hired, attractive in a quiet way that reminded him of Barbara 20 years earlier. Her husband worked for naval intelligence. Walter engineered a friendship that became something more. They met for coffee, then lunch, then afternoon drinks at a hotel bar. By summer, they were having an affair that Walter justified as operational necessity. Janet talked freely about her husband's frustrations at work, the political battles over budget allocations, the tensions between naval intelligence and CIA. Walter listened carefully and reported everything to Pavel. The affair lasted 14 months. It ended when Janet's husband transferred to Norfolk and the family relocated. Walter felt genuine guilt about using Janet, about the betrayal of both her trust and Barbara's, but he compartmentalized the guilt the way he compartmentalized everything else. Barbara suspected something during that period. She noticed Walter's longer hours, his distraction, the subtle distance that had entered their marriage. But she never confronted him directly, perhaps afraid of what she might discover. Their son Michael struggled in high school during those years. He was bright but unmotivated, more interested in cars and girls than academics. Walter attended parent-teacher conferences and worried about his son's future, while simultaneously betraying the country his son would eventually serve. Christine excelled in everything. She was class president, captain of the debate team, bound for a good university. Walter was proud in ways that felt authentic even while living his double life. The money increased to $500 monthly. Pavel introduced more sophisticated tradecraft, brush passes at the Smithsonian where film changed, hands in crowds, signal sites using chalk marks on mailboxes to indicate when drops were loaded, a one-time pad for encrypted messages. Walter's life had split completely. At work, he was the respected engineer whose teams met deadlines and solved problems. At home, he was the father who coached Little League and helped with homework. In the shadows, he was the agent who photographed secrets and betrayed his adopted country. The cognitive dissonance became routine. He no longer felt sharp anxiety during operations. This was simply what he did, who he was. The person he had been in Berlin, the hungry boy surviving in rubble, felt infinitely distant from the suburban professional he had become. By 1972, Walter had been operating for 12 years. He had passed thousands of pages of classified information to Soviet intelligence. He had helped his handlers identify vulnerabilities in American defense programs and assess the capabilities of American satellite systems. The damage was real, measurable, ongoing. But Walter did not think in those terms. He thought about mortgage payments and his daughter's college applications and whether the Redskins would make the playoffs. The compartmentalization was absolute. The FBI investigation began in January 1972 after a pattern of compromised technical specifications suggested a leak at one of several defense contractors in the Maryland area. Special Agent Thomas Brenner led the counterintelligence team assigned to identify the source. Brenner's team created a list of 47 employees across 3 companies who had access to the compromised materials. Walter Koenig's name appeared on that list, one among many, unremarkable in every visible way. The investigation proceeded methodically. Background checks, financial reviews, interviews disguised as routine security updates. Nothing immediately flagged Walter as suspicious. His finances were modest and steady. His reputation at work was excellent. His personal life appeared conventionally stable, but Brenner was patient and thorough. In September 1972, Walter was summoned for a polygraph examination. Standard procedure, his supervisor explained, part of enhanced security protocols being implemented across all cleared personnel. Walter had 3 days to prepare. He spent them following the techniques he had been taught 20 years earlier in Dresden. Control your breathing, separate truth from deception in your mind, believe the lies you tell. The examination took place in a windowless room with a technician who attached sensors to Walter's chest, fingers, and wrist. The questions began broadly, then narrowed toward specifics about unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Walter passed. His vital signs remained steady through questions about espionage, about foreign contacts, about compromising classified materials. Years of compartmentalization had trained his physiology as thoroughly as his psychology. The investigation continued without him knowing. FBI surveillance teams followed Walter for 2 months, photographing his movements, documenting his routine. They saw a man who went to work, came home to his family, ran errands on weekends. They saw nothing suspicious because Walter's tradecraft was too disciplined and the surveillance too intermittent. The random nature of his dead drop servicing, the long gaps between handler meetings, the complete absence of pattern made detection nearly impossible. In March 1973, the investigation shifted focus to other suspects. Walter's file was closed but not discarded, added to the pool of investigated but unresolved persons of interest. Walter learned of his clearance from the investigation through careful observation. Colleagues mentioned the polygraphs, the interviews, the general atmosphere of suspicion that had settled over the workplace. Walter said nothing, expressed mild concern about security, and continued his operations, but the near miss had shaken him in ways he did not fully acknowledge. For 2 months after the polygraph, he experienced sharp anxiety before servicing dead drops. He checked for surveillance obsessively, varied his routes more than necessary, saw threats in innocent coincidences. Pavel noticed during a June meeting and ordered a 6-month operational pause. Walter would continue collecting intelligence but would not service any drops or make any contacts. The material would accumulate, be passed later when security concerns had diminished. The pause was harder than Walter anticipated. He discovered that the espionage had become central to his identity, that the secret knowledge of his double life gave meaning to existence that family and work could not provide. In December, operations resumed at reduced frequency. Walter serviced his first drop in 6 months and felt relief that bordered on addiction. The danger had become necessary, the betrayal a compulsion he could not imagine abandoning. His son, Michael, enlisted in the Army in June 1975. Walter watched his son take the oath to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, while knowing he himself was exactly such an enemy. The contradiction troubled him briefly, then was compartmentalized with everything else. Michael's service and Walter's betrayal existed in separate mental spaces, never touching, never reconciled. The investigation had passed over him, but its shadow remained. Walter was more careful, more paranoid, more aware of his vulnerability. The near miss had taught him that safety was illusion, and discovery was always possible. But he could not stop. The work had become who he was. Walter turned 46 in 1976. The years were accumulating, visible in gray hair and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. His daughter Christine was in college, his son Michael serving in Germany with the Army. His position at Brennan Engineering had plateaued. The company was downsizing, and Walter was moved from active project work to quality assurance and administrative oversight. His access to cutting-edge classified materials diminished significantly. Pavel, disappointed by the reduced intelligence flow, pressed Walter to cultivate new sources. Walter tried without success. The natural connections he had developed over years could not be replicated quickly or artificially. Barbara began showing symptoms of memory loss in 1980. Small things at first, forgetting appointments, repeating questions, misplacing everyday items. Walter noticed but attributed it to normal aging, to stress, to anything except what it actually was. The diagnosis came in March 1981. Early-onset Alzheimer's disease, the neurologist explained. Progressive, irreversible, eventually catastrophic. Barbara was 51 years old, and her mind was beginning to unravel. Walter became her caretaker while maintaining his work and his espionage. The irony was not lost on him. He had to preserve his respectable cover life, even as the person he was covering for slowly disappeared into confusion and lost memory. Barbara's condition worsened steadily. By 1982, she needed supervision for basic activities. Cooking became dangerous. Driving was impossible. She wandered sometimes, forgetting where she was or why she had left the house. Walter hired a part-time aide, but did most of the caregiving himself. He helped Barbara dress each morning, reminded her to take medications, guided her through conversations she could no longer follow independently. His handlers showed no sympathy for his personal difficulties. Pavel was replaced by a handler named Sergei, who demanded continued productivity regardless of Walter's circumstances. Intelligence work did not pause for family tragedies. Walter's final collection of useful intelligence occurred in October 1982. He photographed a comparative analysis of American and Soviet satellite guidance systems, material that still had value despite being less current than what he had provided during his peak years. In April 1983, Sergei informed Walter that he was being placed in reserve status. His access had diminished too much to justify continued active operations. He would maintain his cover and be available if needed, but regular tasking would cease. The payment dropped to $100 monthly, then stopped entirely in August. Sergei made a final contact in November, asking Walter to confirm emergency protocols and maintain the dead drop sites he knew. Then Sergei disappeared. Walter retired from Brennan Engineering in June 1985 at age 55. His pension was modest but adequate. He had worked there for 25 years, half his life, collecting intelligence for 23 of those years. Barbara's care required full-time attention now. She no longer recognized Christine or Michael. She sometimes thought Walter was her father, sometimes a stranger. The personality he had married had been consumed by disease. He sold the family home in Silver Spring in December 1986. The house held too many memories and was too large for his needs. He moved Barbara and himself to a retirement community in Potomac, a smaller apartment where he could manage her care more easily. For the first time in 35 years, Walter had no contact with Soviet intelligence. No handlers, no dead drops, no operations. The work that had defined him had simply ended without ceremony or conclusion. Barbara died on February 3, 1990, in a nursing facility where she had spent her final 6 months. She was 60 years old. At her funeral, Walter realized she had never known who he actually was. Their entire marriage had been based on deception he could never undo. He was alone with secrets he could never share. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. Walter watched the news coverage alone in his apartment, saw young Germans dancing on concrete that had divided their city for 28 years, and felt a hollowness he could not name. He had given 38 years to Soviet intelligence, starting from that conversation with Dmitry Sokolov in the ruins of the Reichstag. He had betrayed his adopted country for a cause that was now collapsing in real time on television. The Cold War that had given structure and meaning to his double life was ending not through nuclear catastrophe, but through economic failure and popular uprising. The great struggle between systems was resolving itself without any of the apocalyptic scenarios that had justified his espionage. Barbara's death 3 months later removed the last anchor to his cover identity. Without a wife to care for, without work to attend, without active intelligence operations, Walter existed in a strange limbo of purposelessness. Christine visited monthly from Pennsylvania with her husband and 2 young children. Michael, now a captain in the Army, called every Sunday evening from wherever he was stationed. Both children believed their father was simply a retired engineer, a widower adjusting to solitude. In June 1991, Walter received unexpected contact. A man approached him at the grocery store and used an old recognition phrase. They met 3 days later at a park bench where the handler explained that Moscow wanted to know if Walter still had operational materials. emergency funds, contact protocols. Walter confirmed he had kept everything as instructed. The one-time pads were hidden in his apartment. $15,000 in emergency funds was buried in a storage unit he rented under a false name. He could be activated if needed. The handler took notes and said Walter would hear from them again. The contact never came. The scheduled follow-up meeting in September was a no-show. Walter waited at the designated location for 2 hours before accepting he had been abandoned. The Soviet Union collapsed in December. Walter watched Mikhail Gorbachev resign on television, watched the hammer and sickle flag lowered from the Kremlin for the final time, and understood that his entire operational life had been for a country that no longer existed. He was 61 years old and had been a spy for 44 years if you counted from his first recruitment in Berlin. Now he was simply an old man in a retirement community, with no country to serve and no handler to report to. The transition to completely normal life was harder than he anticipated. The espionage had been his authentic self, the hidden identity more real than the public face. Without it, he felt hollow, going through motions of existence without purpose. He developed routines to fill the emptiness. Morning walks, chess on Tuesday afternoons, volunteering at the community library. He fixed neighbors' appliances and helped with minor repairs around the complex. He became the helpful old German immigrant everyone liked, but nobody knew. His past felt increasingly unreal, like memories from someone else's life. The dead drops and brush passes and photographed documents seemed like things he had imagined rather than actually done. But late at night, alone in his apartment, Walter sometimes took out the one-time pads and emergency protocols he had kept hidden. He would hold them and remember that he had been someone significant once, had lived a life that mattered, even if it mattered for the wrong reasons. He was a forgotten man in a forgotten war, carrying secrets that no longer had value to anyone except the FBI agents who might someday come looking for him. Walter told himself that day would never arrive. Enough years had passed. The files were probably destroyed. The handlers who knew his identity were scattered or dead. He almost believed it. Walter turned 70 in February 2000. A new century, a new millennium, and he was still alive in suburban Maryland with his secrets intact. Christine threw him a birthday party with his grandchildren, and he smiled for photographs that would someday be evidence in his case file. His life settled into comfortable routines that made the espionage years feel impossibly distant. He woke at 6:30, made coffee, walked the paths around the retirement community. He played chess with other residents, helped neighbors program their VCRs and later their DVD players. The younger residents knew him as Walter the Fix-It Man, the patient old guy who could repair anything and explain technology to people who found it baffling. They had no idea he had once mastered sophisticated espionage tradecraft. His grandchildren visited regularly. Christine's daughter Emily was fascinated by his stories of Berlin after the war, the divided city, the hardships of that era. Walter told carefully edited versions that omitted his recruitment and training, the parts that had led to everything else. Michael's son David showed interest in joining the military like his father. Walter encouraged him, gave advice about service and duty, and felt the familiar compartmentalization that let him support his grandson's patriotism while having spent decades betraying the country the boy wanted to serve. News coverage of espionage cases triggered brief panic attacks. When Aldrich Ames was arrested in 1994, Walter spent 3 sleepless nights wondering if Ames had known anything about him. When Robert Hanssen was caught in 2001, Walter checked obsessively for surveillance and avoided his usual routines for weeks. But the fear always subsided. The years passed without FBI agents appearing at his door. Walter's name apparently existed nowhere in the files of arrested spies, in no testimony or documentation that had survived the Cold War's collapse. He kept emergency funds hidden, more from habit than rational expectation of needing them. $23,000 in cash in a false bottom of his toolbox. Old one-time pads buried in papers at the back of his closet, emergency contact protocols memorized decades ago that probably connected to nothing anymore. In 2006, Walter was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The treatment was successful, caught early, managed with radiation and careful monitoring. He sat in the oncology waiting room with other elderly men and realized he had outlived the country he had spied for, outlived the handlers who had run him, outlived the Cold War itself. His health recovered, but left him feeling mortal in ways he had not before. He was 76 years old. How many years remained? 5? 10? Would he die, having gotten away with it, taking his secrets to cremation without ever facing consequences? Sometimes he wanted to confess, to tell someone what he had done, to stop carrying the weight alone. But confession would destroy his children's lives, would make his grandchildren carry shame that was not theirs to bear. So he remained silent, played chess on Tuesday afternoons, fixed his neighbor's garbage disposals, and lived the quiet life of an ordinary retiree. The secrets had become so deeply buried he sometimes forgot them himself, went days without thinking about dead drops or brush passes or the decades of betrayal. He was Walter Koenig, helpful neighbor, doting grandfather, retired engineer. The other identity, the one that had been more real for most of his life, had faded into something like fiction, until March 17, 2009, when the doorbell rang at 7:15 in the morning and 7 FBI agents came through his door with a search warrant and decades of patient investigation behind them. The forgotten past had finally caught up with him. The Russian defector walked into the American embassy in Moscow on a cold afternoon in October 2007. He was a mid-level SVR officer named Konstantin Petrov, bringing with him digital copies of old KGB, files he had copied before his decision to defect. Among those files was operational documentation on American illegals and long-term assets from the Cold War era. Thousands of pages detailing recruitments, operations, tradecraft, payments. Most of the assets were dead or retired, the operations decades old, but the FBI still wanted the information. Special Agent Sarah Holbrook was assigned to review files related to technical intelligence collection from defense contractors. She worked methodically through case summaries, looking for patterns and details that might identify assets who had never been caught. One file caught her attention. Codename Mechanique, recruited in Berlin in 1947, trained as an illegal, sent to America in 1952. Active collection from 1960 to 1983, focusing on missile guidance systems and satellite technology. The file contained no true name, but it included operational details. Mechanique had immigrated through Displaced Persons Program, had worked at defense contractor in Maryland, had family connection that provided additional access, had been placed in reserve status in 1983 when access diminished. Holbrook created a search matrix using the details from the file. She cross-referenced immigration records of German refugees from 1951 to 1953 with employment histories at Maryland defense contractors during the 1960s and 70s. The pool of potential matches was manageable. 42 names appeared on her initial list. Most could be eliminated quickly through death records, through verification they had never held security clearances, through confirmed relocations outside the operational area. By January 2008, Holbrook had narrowed the list to 8 candidates. One of them was Walter Koenig. Arrived February 1952, as displaced person from West Germany. Employed at Brennan Engineering from 1960 to 1985. Secret clearance. Brother-in-law worked at Defense Intelligence Agency during key years. The correlation was strong, but not conclusive. Holbrook needed more before approaching a federal prosecutor. She began building a timeline matching known leak dates from the Koenig file against Walter Koenig's employment records and movements. The patterns aligned. Documents compromised in March 1967 corresponded with a project Walter had supervised. Intelligence leaked in November 1970 matched materials he would have accessed. The circumstantial evidence accumulated steadily. In May 2008, Holbrook received authorization to place Walter under surveillance. Not arrest, not interrogation, just observation. Watch the 78-year-old man, document his activities, look for anything that suggested continued contact with Russian intelligence. The surveillance teams watched Walter walk his neighbor's dog. They photographed him, playing chess at the community center, shopping for groceries, visiting his daughter in Pennsylvania. They saw an ordinary elderly man living an unremarkable retirement. But they also noted his careful habits, the way he varied routes for routine errands, the way he checked for followers before getting into his car, the way he paused at intersections to observe traffic patterns. Tradecraft that had become instinct, still practiced decades after operations had ceased. In December 2008, FBI Director Mueller was briefed on the case. The decision was made to execute arrest and search warrants rather than continue surveillance. Walter was 79 years old. Waiting longer risked losing him to natural death before accountability could be achieved. The warrants were prepared through January and February 2009. Federal prosecutors reviewed evidence and confirmed sufficient grounds for espionage charges. Search locations were identified, including Walter's apartment and a storage unit he rented under the name William Koch. Operation Belated was scheduled for March 17th. The FBI found the Minox camera in Walter's bedroom closet within the first 20 minutes of searching his apartment. It was wrapped in oilcloth inside a box labeled winter clothes, preserved carefully despite decades without use. They found the one-time pads an hour later, hidden inside a hardback copy of a German engineering textbook from the 1950s. The pages had been hollowed out carefully, creating a space that held 3 small cipher pads with Cyrillic notations. The emergency contact protocols were in a sealed envelope taped to the back of a dresser drawer. Lists of telephone numbers, addresses in 3 cities, recognition phrases in German and Russian. Instructions for what to do if arrest seemed imminent. The money was in his toolbox in the storage unit. $23,000 in cash, mostly hundreds, vacuum-sealed in plastic bags inside a false bottom. Emergency funds that had been waiting unused for nearly 30 years. Walter sat in the back of an FBI sedan and watched agents carry boxes out of his apartment. His neighbors stood in doorways and stared. Mrs. Patterson from down the hall looked confused and frightened. Tom Rodriguez, who Walter had taught to play chess, would not meet his eyes. At FBI headquarters in Washington, Special Agent Holbrook read Walter his rights again and asked if he understood. Walter said yes in a voice that sounded tired and old. She asked if he wanted a lawyer present before answering questions. Walter said yes, but then started talking anyway. The relief of finally being discovered overwhelmed every strategic calculation he had learned over 60 years. He was exhausted from carrying secrets, from living in fear of this moment, from being someone he was not. He told them about Berlin in 1947, about Dmitry Sokolov in the ruins of the Reichstag. He described the training. Facility outside Dresden, the manufactured identity, the immigration to America under false papers. He detailed his recruitment approach, his employment at Brennan Engineering, his methods for photographing classified documents. He identified dead drop locations from memory, sketched diagrams of signal sites, explained tradecraft techniques he had used decades earlier. The interrogation lasted 6 days across multiple sessions. Different agents rotated through, asking questions that tested consistency, probing for details that could be verified against the Russian files. Walter answered everything, holding nothing back. He named his handlers as he had known them, though he understood the names had been false: Victor, Pavel, Sergei. He described their appearances, their mannerisms, the locations where they had met for briefings. He admitted to photographing thousands of pages of classified materials over 23 years. He acknowledged that his intelligence had helped Soviet missile programs, had compromised American satellite security, had given strategic advantage to an enemy power. The damage assessment began immediately. Analysts reviewed declassified materials Walter had accessed, trying to calculate harm from intelligence past 30 years earlier. The conclusion was significant but not catastrophic, important but not existential. Federal prosecutors offered a deal on the 4th day: plead guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage, cooperate fully with ongoing counterintelligence reviews, accept life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The alternative was trial and potential death penalty consideration. Walter accepted without hesitation. He was 79 years old and tired of hiding. He wanted the burden lifted, even if the cost was dying in prison. His children learned the truth from FBI agents who interviewed them as part of the investigation. Christine called Walter once at the detention center and asked simply, "Why?" Walter had no answer that satisfied either of them. Michael refused all contact. His father had betrayed everything Michael had served for 30 years in the Army. The betrayal was unforgivable, the relationship over. Walter stood in federal court on June 4, 2009, and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. Walter was transported to Federal Correctional Institution Schuylkill in Pennsylvania 3 weeks after sentencing. He was 79 years old, inmate number 478-32083, with a life sentence and no possibility of release. The prison held 1,200 men of various ages and crimes. Walter was assigned to a minimum security unit for elderly and infirm prisoners who posed no physical threat. His cellmate was an 81-year-old tax fraudster named Harold, who slept most of the day. Prison routines replaced the routines of his retirement community: wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignment at 8. Walter was assigned to the library, shelving books and helping inmates find materials for legal research or personal reading. He was good at the work, patient with men who struggled with the card catalog system, able to track down obscure titles through interlibrary loan. The prison librarian, a civilian employee named Mrs. Chen, appreciated his diligence and his quiet competence. Other inmates knew his crime from news coverage: the elderly spy, the Cold War relic, the traitor who got away for decades. Some avoided him, viewing espionage as a uniquely contemptible crime. Others were curious, asking questions about spying in the Soviet Union. Walter answered honestly when asked. He described his recruitment, his training, his operations. He did not glorify the work or claim noble motivations. He had been a spy for complicated reasons that included survival, ego, money, and eventually habit. In October 2009, he began teaching GED preparation classes. Many younger inmates had never completed high school, and the GED offered a credential that might help after release. Walter taught mathematics and basic science, subjects he knew well from his engineering background. His students called him Professor. They worked seriously with him because he treated them seriously, without judgment about their crimes or their educational failures. Several men passed the GED exam and wrote to thank him afterward. Christine visited once, in December 2009. The meeting was awkward and painful. She asked questions Walter could not answer satisfactorily. Why had he done it? Had he ever thought about his family? Had any of their life together been real? Walter tried to explain the compartmentalization, how he had been genuinely both people, how his love for her and Michael had been authentic even while living his other life. Christine listened and left without saying she would visit again. She never did. Michael never came, never wrote, never acknowledged his father's existence. Walter understood and accepted this. Michael's entire career had been built on service and loyalty. Walter's betrayal had destroyed something fundamental in his son's sense of identity. One grandson visited in April 2011. David, Christine's son, came alone without telling his mother. He was 23, curious about his grandfather, trying to understand family history that had suddenly become shameful and complicated. They talked for 2 hours. Walter described his life as honestly as he could, trying to help David understand choices that perhaps could not be understood. David asked if Walter had regrets. Walter said yes, profound regrets, but they had come too late to change anything. Health declined steadily through 2012 and 13. Walter developed diabetes, high blood pressure, early signs of heart disease. The prison medical staff managed his conditions with medication and regular monitoring. He was 83 in February, 1013, and felt every year. His hands shook slightly. His memory showed gaps. Walking required careful attention to balance. He was old in ways that prison seemed to accelerate. Historians interviewed him that year, researchers studying Cold War espionage who wanted first-hand accounts before the generation died. Walter spoke to them for hours, describing tradecraft and operations and the psychological mechanics of living double lives. Winter in prison was cold in ways that went beyond temperature. Walter turned 85 in February 2015, lying in his cell with a respiratory infection that would not clear despite antibiotics and the attention of prison medical staff. He was transferred to the prison medical facility in early March when his breathing worsened and his heart showed dangerous irregularities. The small ward held 6 beds for inmates too sick for general population, but not sick enough for outside hospitalization. Walter lay in the narrow bed and watched through the window as snow fell on the prison yard. He thought about Berlin in winter 1945, about the cold that had killed more refugees than bombs. He had survived that winter and 69 more, but this one felt different. His health declined rapidly through the first week of March. Heart failure, the doctors explained, complicated by pneumonia and diabetes. His body was simply wearing out after 85 years of use. They could make him comfortable, but could not reverse the decline. Christine came when the prison called to say her father was dying. She sat beside his bed for 2 hours while Walter drifted in and out of consciousness. She held his hand and cried for the father she had known and the stranger he had actually been. Walter was lucid enough to recognize her. He whispered an apology she could barely hear. "Sorry for the lies, sorry for the betrayal, sorry for destroying the family." Christine said nothing, just squeezed his hand and let him see that she was there. Michael did not come. Christine had called him, but he said he had nothing to say to their father, no forgiveness to offer, no final words that mattered. The bitterness had not diminished in 6 years. Walter died without seeing his son again. On the morning of April 9th, 2015, Walter woke before dawn and knew this would be his last day. The knowledge was certain, felt in the labored beating of his heart, in the difficulty of drawing breath, in the strange clarity that sometimes comes at the end. He thought about the choices he had made over 85 years. The hungry boy in Berlin who had accepted work from Soviet intelligence. The young man who had built a false identity and immigrated to deceive a country that had welcomed him. The husband and father who had photographed classified documents while his children did homework upstairs. He wondered what his life might have been if he had refused that first approach from Dmitry Sokolov in 1947. Different, certainly, possibly better, though survival in post-war Berlin had required moral compromises regardless of which path he chose. The espionage had given his life structure and meaning for 44 years. The secret knowledge of his double identity had made him feel significant in ways that ordinary life never could. But the cost had been profound, measured in betrayed trust and damaged children and decades of living lies. Barbara had died, never knowing who he actually was. Christine and Michael would carry the shame of his choices for the rest of their lives. His grandchildren would grow up with a family history they would want to hide. Walter closed his eyes and felt himself slipping away. The prison ward, the narrow bed, the monitoring equipment beeping beside him, all faded into distance. He was somewhere else, someone else, the Berlin boy again, or the young immigrant, or the suburban father. He died at 9:47 that morning. A nurse found him during rounds, noted the time of death, completed the paperwork. The prison chaplain was notified. Christine was called. There was no funeral. Walter's instructions had specified cremation, no service, no ceremony. His ashes were released to Christine, who scattered them in a river without ceremony or witnesses. The Potomac Gardens retirement community held no memorial service for Walter Koenig. The management sent a brief notice to residents informing them of his death and thanking him for his years of service to the community. No mention was made of how or where he died. The chess club removed his nameplate from the tournament trophy he had won in 2006. The engraved plaque that had read Walter Koenig, champion, was replaced with a blank space that looked like someone had been erased from history. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived down the hall from Walter for 20 years, told other residents she had always thought there was something strange about him. Too quiet, too careful, too helpful. In retrospect, the signs had been obvious, she claimed, though she had noticed nothing at the time. Walter's apartment was cleaned and repainted by the management company. A new tenant moved in 6 weeks after his death, a widow from Baltimore who knew nothing about the previous occupant. She hung new curtains and arranged her furniture and never wondered about the man who had lived there before. The FBI kept detailed records of Walter's case in classified files that would remain sealed for decades. His confession had provided valuable insights into Soviet intelligence tradecraft and long-term illegal operations. Young counterintelligence agents studied his case in training, learning from the patience and discipline that had kept him undetected for so long. Special Agent Sarah Holbrook, who had identified Walter through painstaking analysis of Russian archives, was promoted and transferred to a supervisory position. She occasionally thought about the elderly man she had interrogated, the strange gap between his ordinary surface and his hidden reality. At Brennan Engineering, now merged with a larger defense contractor and operating under a different name, no one remembered Walter Koenig. The employee records from the 1960s and 70s were archived in storage facilities, accessible only to historians and investigators with proper clearances. The technical documents Walter had photographed over 23 years had long since been declassified or rendered obsolete by advancing technology. The satellite systems and missile guidance programs he had compromised belonged to a different technological era. Historians debated whether his espionage had significantly affected the Cold War's trajectory. The consensus was that individual spies like Walter mattered less than broader economic and political forces. The Soviet Union had collapsed despite the intelligence advantages provided by agents like him. But Walter had not lived in the realm of historical analysis. He had lived in the realm of personal choice, of daily decisions to betray or to refuse betrayal, of compartmentalization that let him be loving father and dedicated spy simultaneously. Christine sold the contents of Walter's storage unit without examining them closely. The false-bottom toolbox where emergency funds had been hidden was donated to Goodwill. The old engineering textbooks went to a library sale. Whatever other secrets might have been tucked away were dispersed to strangers who would never know their significance. David, Christine's son, changed his surname legally in 2016. He could not escape being Walter Koenig's grandson, but he could avoid carrying the name. He married and had children who would grow up never hearing about their great-grandfather, the spy. Michael retired from the Army as a full colonel and moved to Arizona. He refused to discuss his father with anyone, including family. The subject was closed, the relationship severed completely, the betrayal too fundamental to forgive or understand. In Berlin, now reunited and transformed, no monument marked the ruins where Walter Hartmann had met Dmitry Sokolov in 1947. The bombed-out buildings had been cleared away, replaced by new construction. The Cold War that had shaped Walter's entire life existed only in museums and memories. The chess set Walter had been playing against himself the night before his arrest was donated to the community center. New players used it without knowing its history, moving pieces across a board where Walter had spent countless hours in a retirement he had not earned and a peace he had not deserved.